So first, we are pleased to hear from Bronte Alexander, who was the winner of our postgraduate prize last year. She is a postdoctoral research fellow at Griffith University, and her research on debilitating mobilities and carceral care in Brazil's military-humanitarian response provides a critical exploration of the military response to Venezuelan migration in Brazil's northern borderlands. Bronte's work delves into the spatial-temporal infrastructures and practices of humanitarianism, revealing the underlying logics and implications of such interventions. Her emphasis on the tension between care and control in the security humanitarian nexus is a crucial contribution to our understanding of the risk management policy initiated around migrants and refugees. Without further ado, Bronte, and it's over to you.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Got a little slides going here. Can everyone see that all right? Yep, perfect. Thanks everyone for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And yeah, let's get started. Before I do, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm zooming in from tonight. So here on the Gold Coast, that is the people of the Yugambeh and Kombumerri region. And I would like to acknowledge that their sovereignty and their lands were never and have never been ceded. And when I'm talking about Brazil, I also like to extend that acknowledgement to include the indigenous peoples of the lands where I conducted this research in northern Brazil, as well as the many indigenous people from Venezuela, including largely the Warao population, who many of whom, migrated and traveled through that same region. So what I'm presenting today is based off of my PhD research, which was all finished and completed last year. And when I started doing this, I had this kind of idea that I was going to sum it all up. And then very quickly realized that wasn't going to happen. It's a lot to summarize in a 20-30 minute talk. So I've decided to focus on kind of the conceptual driver of this research, which is this idea of debilitating mobilities. And it is actually already written, or part of it is written in a journal article in the Mobilities Journal, if you'd like to have a look. But yeah, essentially I'm going to unpack as much as I can in this period of time what debilitating mobilities means and how that relates to Brazil's military humanitarian response. So, of course, I'm gonna do this. All right. All right, so a little bit of background to the context. So essentially looking at Brazil's response to Venezuelan migration, and this was happening mostly through the shared land border in the very north of Brazil. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this in the very north is the state of Roraima. So this is Brazil. This is the capital city of Boa Vista. And if you kind of follow along this road, we meet the border here in a city called Pacaraima, which meets the kind of southeast part of Venezuela. Now, in 2018, Brazil launched a federal humanitarian task force. They called it Operação Acolhida, which sort of loosely, vaguely translates to mean Operation Welcome. And this is essentially led by the state, and it relies on several state departments, including very heavily on the Ministry of Defense. But there's also like a big collaboration that happens with major international humanitarian organizations like UNHCR, IOM, and of course those kind of smaller national and local groups as well. So in my research, I focused on the response to people who had crossed the border and been processed as either temporary migrants or refugees. And kind of throughout the thesis, I then kind of narrowed down to focus on people who were desabrigado, which essentially means people who are living without adequate shelter, and, you know, kind of oftentimes likened to people who are homeless or experiencing homelessness. So in 2019, which is when I was there, there were about 270,000 Venezuelans in Brazil, and about 500 people were crossing into the border daily. Of course, not all of them were staying in Brazil. There was a lot of kind of circular movement to and from the border, where, you know, people would come over to collect supplies and then go back, or, you know, they might use Brazil as kind of a transit point for onward migration throughout Latin America. So a little bit on methodology, try to do this fairly quickly. As I said, I was in Brazil late 2019. I conducted volunteer work with a local civil society group, and their focus was really on providing hygiene products, hygiene-related infrastructure and education for those people who were living without adequate shelter in both Pacaraima, the border city, and Boa Vista, the capital. It kind of shows why I sort of ended up focusing on that group later in my research. So I drew on elements of spatial ethnography. So that's kind of written up by Annette May Kim, really interesting work, highly recommend. And what this does is it essentially highlights this importance of analyzing both the physical space as well as the social relations and power dynamics that happen in place. And I kind of did this by conducting participant observation, mud mapping, you know, in-depth interviews, and a whole bunch of informal conversations with all different people, aid workers, military and policing personnel, local residents, and of course, people from Venezuela, but most of whom were actually working as volunteers with different humanitarian organizations. And for the research, I also drew on E.O. Wiseman's idea of the political plastic, which is that every political act is registered in space. And by looking kind of through this lens, we can uncover the underlying logics and aims of political, neoliberal, and military forces that have contributed to the construction of spaces of control. And I think what I want to highlight here is how thinking about the response in Brazil can be seen as this act and approach of military humanitarianism. And military humanitarianism, which is a mouthful, which is hilarious in the introduction. People stumble on it all the time. So yeah, Martina Tesioli and Glenda Gorelli, they kind of say that it's consists of these two prongs, really, which is military forces completing humanitarian tasks, but also the militarization of humanitarian work. And we really see this playing out explicitly in Brazil. And I kind of showed that it's this very approach that creates the conditions for debilitating mobilities to occur. But before I get into that, a little bit of context. So I'm thinking through the humanitarian security nexus here, which, you know, a lot of scholars have kind of talked about in terms of this relationship between care and control. And in kind of very simple terms, we might think of this as being a tension between providing humanitarian care to people who are framed as victims or being at risk, while at the same time trying to control the same population because they are also portrayed as being criminals or threats or risky. So to manage these risky and at-risk populations, my research investigated spatial infrastructures of containment. So containment here, it's not the same as confinement. It's not about stopping or preventing movement altogether, but rather it's about the altering, the disrupting, and the controlling of autonomous movement. And we can often see this playing out in humanitarian spaces like the refugee camp, you know, where they've kind of become these sort of quasi or semi-carceral spaces that really work to contain mobility with things like walls, fences, barbed wire, surveillance, entry-exit controls, curfews, and things like that. So talking about debility. Kind of didn't want to talk about theory this whole time, but it is quite important to draw out some of these key notions of debility. And this is based on Jasper Puar's, oh, that's my cat, sorry. Jasper Puar's, fantastic work on really looking at Israel's control over Palestine, which is very relevant. But you might be wondering why this is relevant to Brazil. I often get that look straight away. So hopefully we can find out how. But essentially, Puar presents this idea of debility as being bodily injury, illness, and or exclusion that is endemic. So it's regular, it's ongoing. And she discusses this in relation to the IDF's supposedly humanitarian practice of shooting to maim rather than shooting to kill the subject. And what maiming does is it creates long-term injury by debilitating bodies. So for Puar, the right to maim, it disrupts and expands the biopolitical and necropolitical binary of life and death. So we might think about this binary as being the ability to, on one side, make live and let live, and on the other side, make die and let die. But for Puar, debilitation is actually its own status, and it rests outside of this binary. I'm sorry, my cat is just here, like, why aren't you giving me attention? It's bedtime. Okay, so it rests outside of this binary, and she says that this is because neither living nor dying is the aim, but instead debilitation itself is the end goal. And it doesn't occur by accident, it doesn't occur as an incomplete death, but it is intentional and it's used as a primary vector of control. And importantly, for this research, especially, debilitation is really framed as a humanitarian approach to preserving life. It masquerades as let live because it doesn't shoot to kill, doesn't actually result in death, but actually it operates and it acts as will not let die. So essentially for my PhD, I worked to apply this notion of debility to the concept of mobilities. And again, trying to break this down pretty simply here. So we might think about cross-border mobility. And we could see that maybe by completely denying people entry into a country, this could be seen as shooting to kill. But in Brazil, Venezuelan mobility is actually permitted. We do have to remember, though, that this mobility is viewed as risky and threatening. And so this mobility is intentionally securitized and it's very tightly governed. And this is impacted across all scales: cross-border mobility, urban mobilities, embodied, everyday, intimate mobilities. Within this, access to resources and services are also very tightly controlled. So the result of this, which is much like the debility that Puar speaks of, is this reproduction of ongoing exclusion and othering and precarity for migrants and refugees. And importantly, those same people who are criminalized here are also framed as victims, and they are provided protection by way of refugee status and access to basic humanitarian aid. And so this is kind of like the crux of it, which is that this logic and this approach, it does what debility does. It masquerades as let live by enabling cross-border mobility, when in fact it operates as will not let die by altering, containing, capturing, and maiming migrant mobility, all while at the same time providing access to basic needs. So by doing this, essentially the logic of debilitating mobilities, which we might see as a mechanism of state security, has these ongoing exclusionary implications, and these essentially become invisibilized under the guise of humanitarianism because of that kind of provision of basic needs. So how does that play out in Brazil? Let's see. I mean, again, like I said at the start, I had a whole kind of thesis to unpack this. So I'm just going to touch on a few things here. And firstly, I'll just draw attention to the militarization of the response itself. And we see this really, you know, with the involvement of the military in these humanitarian operations, but also in heightened urban security. So when I first arrived in Brazil, in the capital of Boa Vista, the first thing that really struck me was just the sheer number of military and policing personnel that I just saw on the streets everywhere. They weren't confined to those kind of refugee spaces or shelters, but they were just kind of everywhere, shops, restaurants, parks, all over. So in 2019, there were about 700 military personnel deployed to Boa Vista, which is really quite a sizable amount if we think that the city itself is only about 400,000 people. And I mean, these military people, they're not all there for security purposes. You know, some are there to help construct shelters, others are there to kind of deliver goods, but they do also work very closely with military police and specialized SWAT teams. So essentially, it was quite safe to say that their presence in the city was very visible, and it was definitely felt. And we can see this with things like in that photo that I've sourced here, with checkpoints across the city and kind of surveillance going on as well. So these securitization strategies work to contain, alter, and control the everyday risky mobilities of Venezuelan refugees and migrants who have been criminalized within this response. Now, it's kind of a side note, the justification for this heightened securitization was the threat of increased crime in Boa Vista. And I do want to say that, yes, crime had actually increased, but at the time it really was reported that it was mostly kind of petty theft. It was, you know, kind of the robbery of food and goods to supply for family members. But there were also some concerns for arms trafficking across the border as well. But what I want to draw attention to is that this securitization reveals a normalization of militarism in Brazil. And it shows how there's a securitized culture of violence that is infused into everyday life. And we can actually see this all throughout the country in their favelas or slums, where military police and SWAT teams are regularly deployed to violently pacify populations who are considered risky or threats or criminal. So this same security framework has essentially embedded itself and become entrenched in the humanitarian response. And I thought I would just share a little bit that the slogan of the army kind of reveals this itself. It's Braço forte, mão amiga, which means strong arm, friendly hand. That was quite telling. Now, urban migrant mobilities are not only securitized, they're also subject to processes of hygienization. Now, this is a translation of a Brazilian term, higienização, and it's what Jeff Garmany and Matthew Richmond describe as, I've popped it on the screen there, instances where low-income people are violently displaced from specific areas, often by or with the state, for purposes of urban beautification and the restoration of order. So much like the urban securitization that was just on the previous slide, this process mostly targets people in Brazil who are living in favelas, who are often typically urban, poor, and/or Black. In Boa Vista, many of the migrants and refugees who are living without adequate shelter also face forced urban displacement led by the state with support from Operation Welcome. And we can see this through things like tough policies on camping and occupying public spaces, decision-making processes that neglect to include Venezuelans, and the actual physical removal of people from these places. So, for example, the image on the screen here is of an old abandoned building that had kind of been turned into this informal settlement or spontaneous occupation. So when I visited the site, there was around 400 people living. It's actually a collection of a few different buildings. So 400 people were residing there, you know, pretty poor conditions. You know, there's issues with electricity, water, access to bathrooms, and things like that. However, many people who were working with, the population staying here discovered that many were making this active choice to remain in the informal settlements rather than in institutional refugee shelters, because then they would have to abide by the rules set by the army, dealing with things like entry and exit controls, curfews, what food they ate, and at what time. So I attended a meeting about the future of these settlements, and I later found out that this one had been destroyed and the residents displaced. But this was just really one example. It happened all over the city. Anytime people would set up camp in public parks or old buildings, the Operation Welcome Task Force, with help from those, military police and SWAT teams, would shut them down and they would be forced to relocate. A lot of the times the people who were staying there would be transferred to institutional shelters or other places when they were full, like military training gymnasiums. But either way, their mobilities would be more easily monitored and controlled. And again, just as another side note here, I don't really want to romanticize these informal settlements because, they are very challenging conditions. But I do want to highlight the decision-making processes, the policies, and the physical removal of people from those spaces, and how essentially that's cloaked in this humanitarian discourse of hygiene and protection, when really we can kind of see that it's also about securitizing urban space and managing those risky mobilities. And we see this in the next two sites that I'm going to show you. But first, I want to just read a vignette of this site. So what you're looking at here is just a screenshot, obviously, but it's of the back end of the Rodoviaria shelter. It's not really a shelter, it's more like an overnight dormitory. So I'm just going to read like a little snapshot, so hopefully you can get a little bit of an idea of how it was when I arrived at this place. So I say that we walk down the road, following the fence boundary towards what looks like white sails covering a cluster of tents. I see Operation Welcome signs posted on the fence with writing in both Portuguese and Spanish. We reach a section where a few metal barricades have been placed, presumably to stop the flow of vehicles down this road. There is a small break in the fence, which opens up to allow people to move in and out of the shelter. Despite seeing a few handfuls of people on the path, there doesn't seem to be anyone inside, and I'm told that the shelter is closed during the day. We walk through the entrance and I take in the general design. The shelter's core structure seems to be determined by what was seemingly already there. A heavy concrete floor that looks like an enormous paved island, surrounded by bitumen and dirt. Rows and rows of single-person army tents line the area, creating the impression of a sea of green camouflage that makes this feel more like an army base for resting soldiers. The tents are covered by tall erected marquees, forming a barrier between sleeping bodies and the stars above. From where I stand, I can't see where the tents end and the road begins again. There is a strange sense of being cramped and contained, and yet also unbounded by the vastness of the space. We're the only people walking through at this time, and I feel the urge to whisper, so as to match the eerie silence that surrounds us. The tents are so densely packed together that we can't move between the rows, and instead just make our way through the designated pathways around the edges. So yeah, I thought I would just include that so you get the visual and a little bit of what's going on in my mind at the time. Okay, so I'm actually, just to kind of round this off, I'm going to talk about two sites. So this is the Rodoviaria that I just talked about, and a set of wash facilities, so water and sanitation hygiene facilities. And these are both located behind the international bus terminal in Boa Vista. And essentially they were set up as humanitarian spaces for those who were living without shelter. And both of the sites are managed by the municipal government as well as the Operation Welcome Task Force. So the first site, the one pictured here, the one that I just talked about, it quite interestingly, it was actually an informal settlement originally. So there was a whole bunch of people because, you know, the location at the bus stop, you know, there was hundreds of people set up there. And essentially it was shut down and it was reconstructed as an institutional site with this top-down governance. And it functions less as a shelter and more as a temporary dormitory. So it's overnight only. You've got to take your belongings when you leave. So the site accommodates about 1,000 people, and the access times are between 4 p.m. and 7 a.m. the following morning. Now, the second site is a set of wash facilities. And in that site, you've got a block of communal showers and sinks for washing clothes. And this wash site is available during the day. So that's 9 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. There's also timed access in there for people to use the showers. So essentially the spatialities and the temporalities of both of these sites really reveal the logic of debilitating mobilities. We see that different infrastructure works to contain and control migrant mobilities while operating under the guise of humanitarianism. And we can see this with, you know, the fencing, the fact that it's enclosed, you know, both of the sites are under constant military surveillance. There's timed access and harsh conditions. So, for example, at the dormitory, as you can see in the image here, you know, the army colored tents, they are the single person tents, but usually there would be 2 people in there or 2 people and a child. And, you know, in that space, everyone has to abide by the curfews set by the army. And at the wash site, the showers, like just taking a shower itself is this really militarized process. So people will enter to have a shower, they'll receive a squeeze of shampoo on their head, and then they're only allowed 3 minutes to have a shower. And that includes people who are caregivers and are showering other people in there as well. So children, for example. When the 3 minutes is up, essentially they're told by being yelled at. And ironically, there are no toilets available at the wash site during the day. So people will use the showers, and this causes all kinds of hygiene related issues. And these are the same issues that are pitched as the humanitarian reasoning for the creation of these institutional sites in the first place. So what we see here is that there's this sense of providing, you know, very basic humanitarian care, while at the same time reproducing exclusion and precarity via these kind of restrictive mobility controls. And it makes me think of Poirot's idea of slow death, this idea of being worn out, having to deal with the maintenance of living and navigating everyday life in a militarized humanitarian setting. Now, this is, you know, reflected across all of the issues that I've discussed. So we see that in the militarization of the response itself, heightened urban securitization, practices of hygienization and forced displacement, and as well the delivery of care in spaces meant for protection. And, you know, the logic and approach of debilitating mobilities manifests through the practices of controlling and altering migrant mobilities, again, rather than entirely preventing them. And this logic kind of adheres, glues, and hangs on to humanitarianism as a means of justifying the militarization and securitization of urban space. And I will say, though, on the side that this approach is not exclusively antagonistic. You know, we do recognize that Venezuelan migrants receive aid in numerous ways, you know, which otherwise they might not have any access to. But by, you know, providing very basic needs of living, a place to sleep or eat and shower, the response is framed as a humanitarian venture of preserving life, you know, while seemingly operating under this parameter of let live. But what I'm trying to show is that the Operation Welcome Task Force doesn't function with the sole aim of protecting and supporting migrants. Rather, it disguises itself as such, while simultaneously enacting control over their mobilities through securitization and hygienization practices across the city, as well as within these spaces of humanitarian care. The end. I see people like silently clapping. It's hilarious.
Thank you, Bronte, for this very great presentation. It was very powerful. The Google Maps screenshots are truly striking and quite terrifying. But saying thank you very much. A little reminder for our audience to put questions in the chat or save them for the live Q&A. And right now we are going to Alexander, our next speaker. Is Alexander W. Anthony, a PhD candidate at Syracuse University, who directs the Central Mediterranean Penal Heritage Project, as well as being the early career representative for the Carceral Geography Working Group. His presentation, Imprisoned in This Living Grave, presents the preliminary results of a fascinating project employing innovative method to create 3D representation of penal sites in the Central Mediterranean. Anthony's work shed light on the inhumanities of confinement from the post-medieval period through the 20th century, providing a unique perspective on the spatial material dimension and experiences of incarceration at that time. Alexander, you can start when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Just 1 second, let me share my screen here. Hi, thank you for inviting me out today. I think I'm going to talk about something a little bit different than maybe what you're used to hearing. Before I get started with my talk, I wanted to just briefly introduce myself, as I've just been elected as the early career representative. Obviously, we take a little bit of a loose definition of early here, although I am an early career academic. I'm a non-traditional PhD candidate at Syracuse University in the anthropology department. Actually, I'm an archaeologist, but I consider myself an anthropological archaeologist. So that's an archaeologist that draws on anthropological social theory and uses archaeological methods to answer their questions. I'm also the director of the Central Mediterranean Penal Heritage Project. If you ever come up with the name of your own project, try to be more concise than that. Trust me, it's a mouthful. Obviously, I'm not a geographer. I'm here, to be honest with you, I'm a little bit being selfish. I've heard a lot of what anthropologists are saying, a lot of what archaeologists are saying about confinement, and it's fantastic stuff, and I encourage you to check it out. But I wanted to step outside my own discipline and see what other disciplines were saying. And when I've been doing that, what I've seen is that what's going on in carceral geography seems to be a lot of overlap with my framework and with what I'm doing. And I'm hoping you see the overlap too by the time I finish my presentation. I mean, ultimately, the goal for my research and my project is to in some way work towards the amelioration of current inhumanities as I see them of confinement. And I think that reaching across disciplines is one of the ways I'm trying to figure out how to reach that goal with my own research. So prior to embarking on my academic career, I spent almost a decade as a field archaeologist or a shovel bum. It's just a field archaeologist who jumps project to project, company to company, excavating sites across the US. Eventually, one of my first sites of confinement that I worked at was the Milwaukee County Poor Farm Cemetery. It's a cemetery associated with a poor farm. And I ended up writing my master's thesis on that cemetery before going to Syracuse University for my PhD. Now, of course, during that time, I read a lot of Foucault and Goffman and other scholars. And Foucault points towards Jeremy Bentham and his architectural creation of the panopticon as the birthplace of the modern Western penal apparatus and surveillance society. Many historians, Foucault included, note that Bentham was heavily influenced by Enlightenment philosophers on the Italian peninsula, especially Cesare Beccaria, who even Foucault cites extensively. Yet little, if any, material culture analysis of that region, of early modern prisons in that region has taken place. So this led me to thinking about modern prisons in the Central Mediterranean, specifically panopticons and surveillance and the changing embodied experiences of confinement as the use of surveillance has become more intensified. I think it's impossible to ignore the complicit use of surveillance in technological surveillance today in our homes and in society. I have a smartphone sitting next to me right now that I'm sure is listening to everything that I say. So this led me to come up with my upcoming dissertation project, which I'll discuss later in the presentation, and to create the Central Mediterranean Penal Heritage Project, or CMPHP. The purpose of the broader project is to digitally preserve sites of confinement in the Central Mediterranean from the post-medieval period through the 20th century for the purposes of heritage preservation and archaeological research. So as long as I mentioned Foucault, I wanted to talk a little bit about theory as well. I promise it won't be long. And now Foucault and Goffman are essential to my work, of course, and I'd like to circle back to them in a moment. However, I'm an archaeologist, so I'm concerned with the ways that the social manifests materially, right? So as such, I draw from Whitmore, and primarily this project is within a new materialist framework. So it's important here to view the prisons, the architecture, and the structures as kind of entry points of analysis, as the artifact under analysis. The building and its walls are material assemblages reflecting past human behavior, but they're also participants, directing, steering, closing off, opening wide. They're acted upon while simultaneously acting upon. It's through studying these interactions between architect and material, between architecture and those held within, and between archaeologist and material culture, which doesn't treat the past as a starting point, but as an outcome of such work. Of course, the structure was acted upon by humans as well. I mean, its very materiality is the result of human activity. However, the goal here is to decenter human agents as privileged actors. As Whitmore said, quote, the aim is to not to remove humans, but to stop believing that we hold a 50% stake in ontological reality. So as prisons have become more commonplace in the modern world, they became these purpose-built structures of surveillance, discipline, and power. And I argue it's impossible to examine the social relations inside of them without treating the architecture as both an active and passive participant. Prior to the emergence of video technologies, tools of surveillance had to be built in, or tools of surveillance had to be constructed in the material environment or attended to through social means. I'm sure most of us are familiar with Bentham's panopticon, and it's founded on the principle of the material world, that the material world is, it's possible to surveil an entire space from a single location. The architectural design includes a central watchtower surrounded by cells which are backlit, outlining the prisoner inside. So since the occupant of the watchtower is intended to be hidden from view, the people in the cells don't know whether and if they're being watched, so they assume that they're always being watched. Now, surveillance is central to Foucault and Goffman's analysis of modern sites of confinement. For Foucault, the creation of Bentham's panopticon marked the beginning of the modern disciplinary apparatus's obsession with surveillance, which has moved out of the prison and now begins well in advance of its gates. Goffman would have agreed, writing of his categorized blocks of people, that, quote, they can be supervised by personnel whose chief activity is not guidance or periodic inspection, but rather surveillance, seeing to it that everyone does what he has clearly been told. So inmates are subjected to this attempted forced removal of their social identity and intense surveillance intended to ensure their subjectivity en masse as criminals. So this project is situated within Foucaultian structures of power, while drawing upon Goffman's dramaturgical approach. Foucault is sometimes accused of having erected this inescapable vision of power in its description of the modern disciplinary apparatus, although I think this is far from true, and I think he argues the same in a 1978 newspaper column in which he states, quote, I do not mean to say that power, from my point of view, is a foundational, unconquerable, absolute entity that one has to kneel before. Rather, the purpose of all of my analysis is that in light of them, we find out where are the weak points of power from which we can attack. So Foucault and Goffman describe this idealized form and nature of the modern disciplinary apparatus, but what about the weak points noted by Foucault? Within the context of this project, I argue that weak points refer to areas which lie outside the literal view of power, so outside of areas of surveillance. This project will identify these weak points of power and examine them for what Scott refers to as hidden transcripts, or those secret social interactions which take place outside of the eyes of power and temporarily subvert it. Now, building upon Goffman's dramaturgical metaphor, Scott defines hidden transcripts as discourse that takes place off stage, beyond direct observation of power holders. Although I argue that this shouldn't be thought of as this binary opposition of resistance and domination. Instead, the enactment of hidden transcripts represents part of what I believe is a carving out of a plot for one's own existence. Catherine McKittrick draws on Sylvia Wynter to define a plot as illustrating social order that is developed within the context of a dehumanizing system as it spatializes what would be considered impossible. So now she envisions plots in two ways, both as this imaginative geography in which one can make a creative space to challenge the system, and as literal plots of land on which enslaved individuals grow food and nourish themselves. So evidence of hidden transcripts, I argue, represent fragmented material remains of what Novak calls plot life or plot living, or in other words, lives lived as fully as possible in the crevices of power. Again, it's not about opposition and resistance, it's about flourishing as much as possible. Okay, so that's it. That's all the theory. I appreciate you sitting with me for that. I hope some of you appreciated the theory. Some of you probably have some comments or questions, which is pretty similar to what my department chair is, which is great. All of this theory is fantastic, but what are you going to do with it with the archaeological material? I plan to use non-traditional archaeological techniques. I'll be using modern 3D digitization techniques to create 3D models or 3D surrogates of extant sites of confinement, which will then be used in concert with GIS analysis and 3D digital manipulation techniques to identify and highlight evidence of what I've called plot living, ideally in the form of graffiti, remnants of clandestine game boards or game pieces, hidden caches. All of these are things that have been discovered archaeologically in the past as well and are well documented in the ethnographic record. So in order to complete this project, I partnered with University of South Florida Institute for Digital Exploration, and I assembled a team of digital archaeologists. Dr. Stefan Assam, who's an early career scholar himself and an associate researcher at USF IDEX. He's responsible for the digital post-processing and creation of the 3D models in this presentation. Sarah Hassam, a master's student at the University of South Florida and staff member for IDEX, and Sarah Mitrovic, an undergraduate researcher at University of Malta. So I want to present, excuse me, two early case studies, which will allow me to kind of discuss the methods I'm using and developed before elaborating on my upcoming dissertation project. I'll begin with the first site, excuse me, we digitized, which also happens to be the earliest, the Guva at Fort St. Angelo in Birgu, Malta. The Guva, an oubliette, or an underground dungeon where the only egress is through a trapdoor in the ceiling, is a 16th to 17th century site used to hold wayward knights of the Order of St. John. These were also known as the Knights Hospitaller. They were Crusader knights who existed well until the Napoleonic era. Fort St. Angelo, the fort that the dungeon is inside of, was constructed in 1530 after knights took over governance of Malta. The dungeon itself is a former water cistern that's inside of Fort St. Angelo. And graffiti, other researchers have found graffiti that evidences that this site was used as early as 1532 for purposes of confinement. Perhaps the most famous occupant was the Italian artist Caravaggio, who was supposedly held there after murdering another knight in a drunken brawl. What we do know is Caravaggio murdered another knight in a drunken brawl. He was held in Fort St. Angelo for sure, and he ended up escaping and fled to Sicily. We don't know for sure that he was held in this particular dungeon. There's no material evidence of it. And as you'll see in the model I'm about to show you and in these photos, it's hard to imagine how he would have escaped without help. It's a fun story either way. So in the summer of 2023, my team and I entered the oubliette to create 3D models of using multiple techniques. The time frame was extremely limited. For conservation purposes, people are only allowed in this cell for about 2 hours at a time. So we had only that time to complete digital survey. In fact, when we entered the cell, the curator himself said this was the first time that he had ever had the opportunity to enter the cell. So we created two digital models, one using structure from motion photogrammetry, in which we used thousands of photographs taken with a Nikon DSLR camera, which were then post-processed and stitched together by Dr. Hassam using AGIS Metashape. We also used a Faro S70 terrestrial laser scanner to create a point cloud model. The Faro S70 is a terrestrial LiDAR scanner capable of capturing up to 1 million points per second. We did a high quality scan of the room and I'm running for approximately 45 minutes. I haven't had the opportunity to analyze the point cloud data yet, so this current presentation focuses on the photogrammetric model. So this is from the outside. Now imagine this is actually underground. The Guva is an example from CMPHP of a digital heritage project where I have no personal future research agenda. The model was made in collaboration with Heritage Malta, the National Heritage Organization, for the purposes of conservation and heritage communications. So here you can see our high quality rendering of the photogrammetric model, which I created a fly-through animation of. One immediate takeaway from the site is the number of coat of arms and Maltese crosses that are visible, almost as though the graffiti is staking a claim to a social identity or a social right. You also see a lot of inscriptions in various languages, in Latin, French, Italian. This one in particular actually lends its name to the title of this presentation. Excuse my Latin. I know some Italian, but no Latin. It says something like "Alla ad carcere sepultura viverum," which loosely translated means buried in this living cell or grave. Let me just restart this quickly so you have something to look at while I talk. It's important. One thing to think about is the time it would take to carve some of this into stone and how long somebody had to sit there to carve this into the stone, especially with how detailed some of this art is. As we make the next turn, you'll see this carriage, which fascinates me. It's incredibly detailed and would have taken a lot of time, in spite of the fact that Maltese stone is notoriously soft. Most are at sitting or standing height with little regard from visibility from the trapdoor above. So maybe this has more to do with visibility for the person carving it, right? And the available lighting while working. One of the things I'm playing with these models is the use of dynamic lighting. There's a steep learning curve for these programs, and I'm at the beginning of it. And we'll see in the next model, I start to play with moving light around, but I'd like to light this oubliette using dynamic lighting to see what it would look like if it was lit by candlelight or by torchlight, and see how that affects the visualization. So even though I don't have a personal research agenda, this does serve as a nice baseline of a non-surveillance-based, non-temporal-based penal confinement, right? It's interesting to think about where's the graffiti located when no one is watching, who's the audience, what's the message, right? In the instance of the inscription that lends its name to this title, we know that that person was executed after leaving the oubliette. So in some ways, this was his final words and still lasts as his final words. Also, although I'm not currently using the model for research, by creating this model, I've created this digital surrogate for future researchers and heritage professionals. As I said, people are only allowed in the oubliette for a short period of time, and this allows researchers to really study this graffiti in detail without the limitations of conservation put upon them for entering the site. It also allows conservators to monitor the degradation of the site over time. They have a capture of 2023 of exactly what it looks like, and they can monitor it over the coming years. So the next site I wanted to talk about is the Prigione del Castello at Noto Antica. Noto Antica is a medieval city that existed from around the 12th century through the 17th century. It was destroyed in a devastating earthquake of 1693. It's sometimes called the Sicilian Pompeii. It's this enormous city which was leveled in 1693 and now is overgrown with vegetation. Noto Antica means ancient Noto, and it's actually a reference to the newer Baroque city of Noto, which some of you may know from White Lotus and other television series and films. Noto, the new Baroque city of Noto, was built after the destruction of the ancient Noto in 1693, about 13 kilometers away. To give you an idea of the size of this disaster, shortly before the earthquake, Noto was home to about 26,000 residents. After the earthquake, only about 12,000 people remained. The city was completely destroyed. It was abandoned and used for an open-air quarry for materials as they rebuilt the new city. If you go there today, as you can see in these photos, there's just rubble everywhere. It's overgrown with vegetation. We didn't do any excavation at the site. We just cleared vegetation so that we could make our 3D models. We wanted to do photogrammetry and terrestrial laser scanning. However, I picked 4 days to go out in the field. The temperatures got to 48 degrees Celsius, both of those 2 days in Sicily. Over 1,400 wildfires raged across the island on those days. And the upper level of the safety range of the terrestrial laser scanning equipment is 50 degrees Celsius. So we decided not to risk it, not to take the equipment out into that weather. So the models, again, we created through photogrammetry. It's hoped that future work will allow some terrestrial laser scanning. So here's an animation. I have 2 animations of this that I'd like to show you. This is the first one. I've begun to minimally play with lighting. What we have is this is lit as though it's lit by sunlight, and I've moved the sunlight around a little bit just to So you can see how the etchings kind of fade in and fade out. They're very hard to see at this site. They're not as well preserved as at Fort St. Angelo, because this is exposed to the elements, of course. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of see them before I shown you my interpretation. This gives you a chance to kind of interpret for yourself and see how difficult it is to actually see the way these come out. As I said, it's not an ideal visualization. My next one will help you out a little bit. Here's just a few seconds left. So you can see how difficult it is to see this. Now, one of the things, as I said, I'm digitally manipulating this so I can play with the lighting, I can play with the different levels, much like you would play with any kind of photograph. Now, here's the second animation, and now this highlights the etchings that we see in the animation. You'll see as we pull up here, at first we see a few ships, at least one ship, two, maybe three. And as we turn, we see several of these squarish target-like etchings that are all on horizontal surfaces. There's another one coming up here, along with my favorite piece of graffiti, a little face that I'm not entirely sure how to interpret the face. But we see a lot of these square target-like pieces of graffiti, which I initially thought may be game pieces or game boards, as they're all on flat surfaces. And actually, just as of yesterday, I was talking to Dr. Hassam about this, and these are most likely been positively identified as 9 men's Morris game boards. It's a game that goes back to the 2nd century. It was really popular in the Roman period. There's at least 4 or 5 of these game boards throughout this site. There's only graffiti in this one room of the 2 rooms this model is made of. There's 4 or 5 of these game boards. Excuse me, I'd like to go see if I can go back to that. Sorry. Sorry about that. This isn't working very well. There we go. That's where I was trying to pause it. I wanted to talk briefly about these ships. It's worth noting the ship graffiti that's found here. Ship graffiti is very common in the region in the Central Mediterranean, especially well documented in Malta by the Malta Ship Graffiti Project. It's churches, it's in prisons, it's everywhere. And the Malta Ship Graffiti Project was really useful in identifying the ships that we see here. This one, I believe, is a galley of the Order of St. John. So the flag that's being flown above has the cross of the order on it. It's a low-lying ship. The triangular sail is indicative of a galley. And also, as we finish playing this model out, we have this inscription that I'm still working on figuring out. Again, through digital manipulation, I'm hoping that I can highlight some of what's written there. But I also wanted to highlight this particular piece of graffiti. We see at least 2 more, maybe 3 more galleys. The flag, or not the flags, excuse me, the flags show the Order of St. John, the cross of the Order of St. John. The sails are up, but what we see are a whole bunch of parallel lines coming off of the low-lying ships, and those are most likely oars for the galleys themselves. Now, it's important. One of the reasons I bring this up, it's important to remember that the people rowing the galley would have been enslaved individuals. Under the Order of St. John, they most likely would have been enslaved Muslim individuals. And it's interesting to think about the fact that when they weren't being on a ship acting as rowers, they would have been held in places of confinement. So there's always the possibility that the people who engraved this etching onto the wall were actually enslaved galley rowers. Now, of course, we can't say that for sure. What we do know for sure is that whoever etched this onto the wall was familiar with the galley and familiar with the Order of St. John. It's clearly not modern graffiti. It probably predates the 1693 earthquake. Now, we know the Knights had a presence in Sicily since the medieval period. The city of Noto Antica had a hospital of the Order of the Knights from the medieval period. However, since the Knights took over Malta in 1530, they became a more ubiquitous presence in the region. So it's likely that this graffiti dates between 1530 and 1693. Obviously, there's a lot more to be done here, and I plan on reaching out to the Malta Ship Graffiti Project with my findings and collaborating with them. But these are some of the early results of the analysis and some of the methods I'm using for digitizing and manipulating those digitizations in order to highlight the type of evidence that's left over so that I can study it better and do a more deeper spatial analysis as I plan in the future. So for my upcoming project, for my dissertation project and to expand the Central Mediterranean project, I plan on scanning a few more sites in Malta, a few more prison sites in Malta, but also I have 3 sites that I plan on digitizing, which highlight the changing nature of surveillance over the following centuries, excuse me. The first being the Carcere dell'Inquisizione at the Palazzo Chiaramonte in Palermo. It's a historic 14th century palace that was repurposed during the Spanish Inquisitions of the 17th to 18th century. Now, the site was constructed prior to liberal penal reform movements and is notable for the prisoner graffiti still present on the walls. A 3-dimensional spatial analysis of the graffiti typology and placement, I'm hoping, will provide some insights on the effects of pre-penal reform ideologies and highlight the social rather than architectural forms of surveillance enacted upon captive populations at that site. It's important to remember that the people accused during the Inquisition were heavily surveilled, if not through material means like the panopticon, then through social means. So it's interesting to think about what we can learn about forms of social surveillance in the creation of biographies from sites like this. I've never seen which owns and oversees this site, the Palazzo, as a museum, and I'll use the modeling as the site as an opportunity to run workshops and digitization techniques with students at the university. I've also identified 2 panoptic or quasi-panoptic prisons in Italy where I'm still negotiating access. The first is the Ergastolo di Santo Stefano. The construction for this project began in 1792, and it was used until the 1960s. So this is an 18th, 19th century prison. The Palazzo Chiaramonte being a 17th to 18th century prison. This is 18th to 19th. It's the first Ergastolo, or prison for life sentences, in the southern half of Italy before Italy became Italy, and maybe the earliest panopticon built in Europe. It's abandoned, as I said, abandoned in 1964 and is becoming a museum. The other site is the Carcere Barbonico di Syracuse, which is in Sicily. It was first commissioned in 1828, not completed until 1854, but that allowed it to give them time to incorporate later reform measures, including consideration of hygiene, work, and religion, instead of being based strictly on surveillance. This site was abandoned in the 1990s after a damage from an earthquake and is currently in a state of disrepair. It will probably collapse if it's not purchased soon at auction. So I'm hoping that by creating this scan, I create potentially the last record of that particular site. So some of my upcoming questions for these sites are, what are the weak points of surveillance? I'd like to test the efficacy of the architectural panopticon. I understand the panopticon is probably not perfect, and it never was, but at the time they were building a better mousetrap, right? And so what were the weak points of this surveillance-based technology that they were creating? And what material remains lie in those weak points? I also want to compare the construction footprints from the 3D models to the actual blueprints to see how the realized manifestation of this architecture differed from the idealized version. And I also plan on using these 3D models in concert with historic documents to create building biographies so that I can understand how not only were the buildings constructed, but how they changed over their life course as changing reform periods and changing ideas over the periods occurred. So I hope you've seen some overlap between my work and carceral geography, especially my upcoming spatial analysis of architecture. The Central Mediterranean Penal Heritage Project is intended to inform upon the lived and changing experiences of incarceration and confinement as we intensified the use of surveillance over the past 500 years, and to think about the ways that evidence left behind speaks to those kinds of experiences. So I'd like to thank you again for the invitation to speak today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for this quite fascinating presentation. I find your work around graffiti and the way that you give life to people that lived a long time ago through them quite incredible. So thank you very much.